So I'd like to share with you some suggested further reading. There are many books you could read about this, but I've chosen just a number that I think do a very wonderful job. Some of them are more dense, some of them are a little bit more pop level accessible, but here we go. First up, A Larger Hope, volumes 1 and 2. Okay, they outline the history of different figures and how they understood this idea of apokatastasis, of the reconciliation, restoration, renewal of all things. Okay, A Larger Hope. This is a really wonderful one, but this one focuses on the early church up to Julian of Norwich. She was a fantastic figure, but this is the first 1500 years of church history. It's a wonderful book. The second volume, though, is... Oh, I held it backwards. It's this one first, and then this one. Okay? And this one goes from the Reformation to the 19th century. I believe there's a third volume coming that's more recent years, but these are great to understand the golden thread of how church history has had many people actually hold to this view. Okay? Next up, That All Shall Be Saved by David Bentley Hart. I gave my copy to somebody special, and I don't have it back. But it is a dense, philosophical, and rhetorical approach to saying this makes sense. In fact, this makes the most sense if you actually look at the New Testament in its original language. But there's also, he wrote a book called You Are Gods on Nature and Supernature. Looks like this. And it's basically about how it is God's planned desire to raise up rational creatures into becoming deified with God, and how actually that understanding of Christianity is actually present all throughout the New Testament. It's just we're not trained to look for it, and so we don't see it. And of course, he gave his own translation of the Greek New Testament. It's put into English, and he decided to let the text be clunky. A number of times, people will translate the Bible into English and will try to smooth out some of it. Try to find an easier language or maybe make it not sound quite as sharp. But to be honest, when you read his translation of the Greek New Testament, you can't help but say, you know what? It does talk about the cosmic scope of God's salvation plan quite often. And he pulls no punches. It is a little clunky to read, but you start to see how this is very much universal in scope, but many English translations in the past 400 or 500 years have actually taken the gospel and made it not as cosmic in its scope as it really is. So, 3 from David Bentley Hart right there. Then we have Her Gates Will Never Be Shut by Brad Jersak. Hope, Hell, and the New Jerusalem. This one is something in between. It's rather scholarly, but I think it's quite accessible. And it looks at a number of the passages that often come up in this discussion. And he does a decent job, truly, of looking at each of them academically and seeing how they relate to passages in the Old Testament, and to actually say, this conversation isn't over, although some people like to think it is. Okay? And this one was just lovely, called Christ the Conqueror of Hell, The Descent into Hades from an Orthodox Perspective. So, the early church has poetry, liturgy, and hymn lyrics that all point towards this idea that Christ descended into hell to overthrow it, to flatten it, to make it into a jailbreak, to destroy it completely so that no one is left down there. But when we shifted in the early church into Latin, at least in the West, we fell away from some of the early church poetry, liturgy, and hymnody that actually help us to understand how the early church for the first 400 years or so, 500-ish, how did they interpret the New Testament? And again, when you look at the liturgy, the hymnody, and the poetry, you're like, oh, that's how they interpreted it. So if they interpret it that way, maybe we should too. It's a little dense, but this one is, it packs a punch. Alvin Kimmel, he's a priest. He's got a fantastic blog all devoted to this topic, and it is just stellar. This book is a compilation of the best blog entries he had done on the topic of apokatastasis. I read this probably in 3 days. He's got some wonderful chapters in here, and I actually think that this is one of the best books on the topic. Okay. And last but not least, and of course there are so many others, get yourself a copy of the Unspoken Sermons of George MacDonald. He was the Scottish preacher that in many ways defended this idea of the restoration, reconciliation, renewal of all things as being properly Christian. The thing is, he has become something of a noteworthy figure because he inspired the works of C.S. Lewis, influenced J.R.R. Tolkien, influenced Lewis Carroll, who wrote Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. If you were to take time and read a sermon of his a day, the logic and the rhetoric, you start to see, oh my gosh, what if he actually interpreted Christianity properly? Whew. So, these books are, I think, some of the best you could read on the topic. By no means are they the final. Is this like a final list of the only books you could or should read about it? There are a number of others that I know about, but for now, these are pretty good starts. So this is just some further suggested reading. Go find them at the author's website or on Amazon. Do whatever you can. Get them. Okay? This was just some suggested further reading.